Welcome to another episode of the podcast. It's great to have you here. We have two guests for the show today, Dan Bach and Tim Riley. Dan is the founder of Jump Science. He's a coach at Xceleration Sports Performance in Austin, Texas. Dan works with track and field and team sport athlete alike. He's been a multi-time guest on this podcast, and a lot of people benefit from the education Dan does through his channels on social media, on sprint training, jump training, and explosive athletic development. Tim Riley is the director of sports performance at Kollective, which is also in Austin, Texas. Tim supervises all pro, collegiate, and youth athletic development there, as well as overseeing and conducting the strength and performance sessions for NFL athletes, professional lacrosse, AVP volleyball, and more. On the show today, Dan and Tim will be getting into their own individual sports training and then strength training, physical preparation training journeys, and how that led them into where they are now. A huge focus of the show will be the developmental, or you could say the total qualities that lead to being an explosive athlete. So often when we look at improving explosiveness, we only look at the end point or the top of the pyramid. We look at the heavy strength training, the high force, high outputs, the high intensity plyometrics. And what we don't realize, and we'll be talking about this, is that you can do something like a high force, heavy strength training with an individual who does not have a good base of movement and ability and explosive high velocity ability preceding that, and you won't get the results that oftentimes people think you will. So Dan and Tim will be going into that extensively. We'll also be talking about a lot of concepts on warmups, assessments, games, and more. This was a really fun chat, and a cool dynamic too with these guys is they're both from the same area. So not only do they have similar coaching trajectories and careers, they also train and work out together, and they also have collaborated on a jump training system together. And it was just really fun chatting with these guys. Before we get to it, I have two sponsors for the show today, and then we'll have an uninterrupted show for y'all. The first is Lost Empire Herbs. If you are looking for natural supplementation in your total performance regimen, I highly recommend Lost Empire Herbs. I've really enjoyed using the products. Clients I've worked with have gotten great results with it as well. And if you want improved strength, health, vitality, energy, then you definitely want to check out what they have to offer. If you want to dip your toe in and just get something for free, just say, hey, what's this all about? What can it do for me? You can get pine pollen for free, and you can do that by going to justflypinepollen.com. You have to pay a typical modest cost of shipping to get it, but it's a great way to get started. And then if you want 15% off anything else in the Lost Empire Herbs store, such as Shilajit, Phoenix Formula, some of my favorites, you can head to lostempireherbs.com/justfly, and you can use the code justfly for 15% off as well. Our next sponsor is the wearable resistance gear, Xceleration by Leela. The future is light, and I say that in the sense that as a coach, I'm always looking for, and as I go forward in my own career and profession, and even in my own training, I look at being able to do more with less. And being able to do more with less is the epitome of the Xceleration gear. It is 100, 200 gram micro weights. So think of that compared to like a 20-pound weight vest. And you're using those micro weights on limbs, arms, legs. You can put it on your torso as well, to really max out angular momentum of limbs in explosive athletic movement. You can do so much with it. It's extremely powerful. You can internally and externally rotate limbs strategically. You can spin the body left or right. You can assist or resist. It's been used by some of the best coaches in the world. Some of the best track athletes in the world are using this, and they're getting awesome results. So if you want to check out the Xceleration gear, you can head to lilateam.com. That's LILA team.com. And you can use the code JFS2023 for 15% off your order there for Xceleration gear. All right. So that all being said, let's get on to the show, episode 355 with Dan Bach and Tim Riley. Just to paint the picture of how you guys see training, I think it's always interesting to look at where you've been. And so maybe not so much even the coaching sphere at first, but tell me a little bit about your athletic story. Like, what sports did you guys play growing up? And tell me a little bit about your story of training and how that led you to where you are now.
So I came from mostly just like recreational and neighborhood sports as a kid, like, like recess and backyard and et cetera, that type of stuff, until getting pretty obsessed with basketball when I was 12. And then that was the only sport I played through high school and through even 1 year of college. And with that basketball mindset, I got into the idea of wanting to dunk when I was 13 and started, dunking on low rims and doing squats and calf raises in my basement bedroom at 13 years old. And that was the start of my training journey and training obsession. So yeah, I mean, I was like a good 2 foot jumper throughout all my basketball career. I was like known as a guy who could jump high. And then, in college started to like after I was done with college basketball, started really focusing on just trying to jump high as opposed to actually getting good at basketball. And that's also when I started training other people. When I got exposure to track athletes and got to work with a couple of them, that's when I discovered sort of that whole realm of one, track athletes being way faster than other people, and two, like how bad I was at it in spite of like all my training background. And that sort of piqued my interest in like, oh, there's this whole untapped area of like max velocity and long jump and triple jump type things that I just like am not familiar with, and like just always thought I was a good athlete, and it turns out I was only a good athlete in like a certain realm, but not this realm. um, and then also, I just like the appeal of being committed to athletic development versus trying to be a good player in a sport. I like the challenge of track and field where it's just straight up how fast can you get or how far can you jump. And so that really appealed to me. So that's kind of the direction that, I mean, I've sort of explored in my own training, but also that's the area that I like to explore and like to work with athletes on, like in my coaching career, and that applies to athletes in a variety of sports, where I believe that developing sort of this wide range of explosive outputs, including max velocity, including bounding for distance, like that applies and makes people better at a lot of things, even if it's completely not sport specific.
Yeah, Tim, how about yourself?
Yeah, me and Dan have some parallels from the training aspect. Though for me, I started my first sport was jujitsu, and I started at like 3.5 and went all the way until I was 8. But then somewhere around 5 or 6, I discovered Michael Jordan and became obsessed. And I would spend, if my parents let me, the entire day from sun up to sundown in my driveway doing 3, 2, 1 countdowns and fadeaways with the tongue out, the whole nine. And I too I wanted to dunk. I would watch Space Jam and be like, Mom, I have to do this. And my parents, I finally nagged them enough. They bought me one of these small trampolines because I couldn't dunk, even though the rim was all the way down. And at like 5 and 6 years old, I would run and jump off this trampoline and dunk. And I did that for years. And like, I would gradually move the rim up, and then of course, like low rim dunks without the trampoline once I was actually able to do so. I fell in love with basketball, and that was my primary sport. All the way into high school, I started playing football as well. Jiu-jitsu kind of fell to the wayside because it wasn't necessarily as cool as it is now. Like I was kind of like the karate nerd, and it didn't matter how many trophies I won. Like I would bring we'd have like show and tell at school, and they'd be like, whatever, loser. So now it's cool. UFC has made it much more acceptable, but it wasn't when, in the mid early 90s. And so, yeah, my athletic career really ended in high school. And it was after high school, I got back into fighting, and I fought semi-professionally for a couple years. And, when my athletic career, organized sports, I should say, ended, I found that, one, I missed it. And two, that I really didn't enjoy training, like the physical aspect of training. Like it was kind of miserable to me when I was playing. And then when sports were gone, like that was the only thing that remained. And it started admittedly with like vanity. Like I wanted to look a certain way, but I got bored with that pretty quickly. And I just kind of became obsessed with training in general. And as the years went by, it became more and more about like, how can I push myself? Like Dan said, I got fascinated with being able to jump higher. You know, I could dunk since probably my sophomore year of high school. Um, and then in my mid-20s, I started taking it as like, oh, I can do this professionally. Like I can do this for a living. And I got just a dinky certification and, got my foot in the door, and it wasn't a dinky certification. It was a good one, but it was, it's just like a random certification. And then from there, it was like gasoline on the fire. Anything sports performance related, I was all over it. I became obsessed with seeing what I was capable of. And then any opportunity I got to train athletes, I prioritized that. And over the past 6 years, that obsession, that desire to learn, the desire to experiment on myself and see what I'm capable of has sort of culminated to where I'm at today.
Cool. Yeah, the martial arts was something that I always wanted to do when I was little. I would always watch like the karate shows and stuff, and imagine I was good at that and practiced all like the kicks and stuff when I was little. But I never formally entered anything. But it's something that my children are 4 and 6, and my 6-year-old will be getting into jiu-jitsu shortly. And part of that's just because I think it's like you said, Tim, with there's sport and training. And I think sometimes when it becomes only training and like the martial arts is something you can always have. Like, there's people doing that type. I mean, granted, it's all something you can always have, but it's spending time with like Rafe Kelly and looking at the different. I remember I went to Return to the Source's seminar a couple of years ago, and the whole group was around. We were doing like some roughhousing, like type grappling type stuff. And there was like 30 people there. And he said, raise your hand if you have martial arts experience. And literally, I was one of the only 2 who did not raise my hand. I was like, I was like, is something wrong with me? Like, I don't, but it's like the more I look at it too, I like reading like Bruce Lee stuff or looking at, you could call it the soft side, the really getting into the inner components of movement as well as just the athleticism. I think that, if I look at like a well-roundedness, for not just like physically, but also mentally, and the way you just look at sport and movement and combat and the embodiment of doing something that's combat or hand to hand, or even like skin to skin, you could say, I think there's something to that. So that's definitely something I'm looking at getting my, we were already going to sign up a while ago, but I'm excited to get my kids in that. I'm excited to like watch, whatever I end up observing. I know that other strength coaches who have put their kids in martial arts and they watch practice, like, oh, they did this, I'm going to put that in my training session for my, general physical. Yeah. If you have anything that I'd be curious that you incorporate.
Yeah. So, I mean, I could go on and on about how I feel like starting martial arts at an early age and learning how to interact and body awareness and leverage and being able to not be afraid how to be in someone else's personal space and discipline. And I could go on and on about that. I can tell you, my daughter, she's 5.5, and I got her into jiu-jitsu at 3.5. And, her first day, she got body slammed and cried and said, Daddy, I never want to do this again. So naturally, we were there the next night. And she fell in love with it, and the confidence. And then now, as she's playing other sports, she's in gymnastics, she does soccer, basketball. I can see a lot of those drills and her body awareness and her ability to fall and get right back up, and how to fall and how to interact with the ground. There are things that she does that seem innate to her that I see other kids struggle with. Now, I may be saying that because I'm biased and I'm her father, but I do feel like there are some things that jiu-jitsu has lent her that she'll probably be able to lean on for the rest of her life.
Yeah, I agree. It's something that I could almost spend like 20 minutes talking about this, but I won't because we have a lot of other things to talk about. And Dan, I have a question about track. I'll ask you in just a second here. But in coaching like youth sports, like I've been coaching youth soccer for I think a little over 2 years now. And it's so interesting because you watch these little kids play, and it's like the biggest thing that stands in a child's way at that level is not so much, it is a little bit their natural skill and speed, but it's a huge part of it is just their fearlessness. And the kids who are afraid, they don't even get in the mix. Like there's like, the big mess of kids are on the ball, and the kids who are timid, like they don't even want to go near it. And it's not that they aren't skilled. It's not that they might not be fast. it's literally they just are uncomfortable, or there's too much information and they check out because they are uncomfortable. But then I also look and I think about it. Well, I think about it in the sense of what happens a lot of times is the parents feel embarrassed that their kid is too timid, so they yell at their kid, get it, But in reality, what if you just, that's where I'm going to be looking at the difference once I enroll my daughter in the martial arts, is to see if that happens organically, because I just want to see how she takes the lessons and the confidence from something that does involve getting in someone's space and all the personal, mental, and emotional things that come with that, and then see how that might transform her next steps as she goes forward. So it's an experiment that I was going to put her in it anyways, but I just think, and maybe it lends to another thing where, you could talk about sports specialization. And one of the things that I think is interesting is I've heard the different sports teach you something mentally different. And I don't think we approach that often. I mean, Dan, I didn't know you were such a specialist in basketball. I was just going to give you some crap about that. So, I was curious too. And I was going to ask you, if you would have done other sports, you mentioned you did track later and you were slower. I'm curious what your thoughts, if you would have started that at like age 12, that's about when I started track. I actually was pretty slow initially, and I was never truly fast. But I think at least starting earlier helped me. I think if I wouldn't have got started early, I would have definitely not had the speed peak that I did later. So yeah, I'm just curious what your thoughts are with, especially for a guy too, like you could jump very high off 2 feet, and I think 1 foot as well. But your 2 foot jump, from my understanding, is your specialty. But I'm just curious how you see yourself and your abilities in light of like what you see at track athletes, like speed, single leg, that quicker reactive end of the spectrum.
I think definitely could have been way, way better at it. I've seen, even being washed up like 35 now, like I still see like signs of progress when I'm consistent with that type of thing. And that's, at my age. And then, in the teenagers or even the 12, 13-year-olds, it's like you get them sprinting a couple times a week. Like you might see a difference within a few weeks, or even sometimes it's like within a couple sessions, like, oh yeah, they're like already faster. And then, like their progress on like hopping or something can just be like, sometimes it's very evident within weeks. And I just think, man, if I would have been doing this when I was, 8, 9, 12, whatever, it could have been a huge difference. And so would I have been a like dramatically higher jumper? I don't know. I mean, I touched the top of the box as a high school sophomore. Like I was a good 2 foot jumper. Would I have been dramatically higher? Maybe not. Would I have been definitely faster? Would I have been jumping quicker? Would I have been jumping, maybe equally high off one leg? Maybe. Would I have, I actually did dabble in track and field, tried high jump as a high school junior. I actually pulled my hamstring doing hurdles and ended up kind of giving up on the season. But, I think that I probably should have been a track and football athlete as well as basketball. If I could go back. If I would have had somebody like my current self to guide me, then I would have had a very, very different sports participation and I believe athletic ability when it comes to speed and quickness. I think probably could have been dramatically different.
Yeah, I would have viewed you, if I had just watched you dunk, I would have thought you would be like an awesome triple jumper or something, if you had started that early with like that kind of movement profile of yours. And
yeah. The other thing that I would still wonder about is, when I got obsessed with jumping, I was doing my standard workout was 2 sets of 100 calf raises 5 days per week. And looking at myself, and now when I get to my late 20s and I'm like, okay, I'm a great jumper, but why is my max velocity so bad? And I really wonder about some of the negative influence of all those calf raises as a teenager versus, as opposed to what if those were all sprinting contacts instead? Mm-hmm. And that's why I'm still I'm still experimenting with, can I reverse that? And I'm trying to, do all the running, all the plyos and lose my ankle mobility and and see if it can, like actually turn back into, a nice, tight, stiff ankle. Of course, being 225 doesn't help either, but doing
Well, I
doing what
will
I can.
say, Dan, I don't, you guys know, anyone listening to this isn't going to be able to see it, but he has lineman calves.
Yeah, I was going to
I'm
say you have
serious.
huge calves, Dan. Is that your secret?
Dude.
Yeah, huge calves.
He has lineman calves.
I remember back from the day with my graduate research, and I was like, Dan, this guy with his huge calves jumping higher than everyone else off 2 feet here.
That's how me and Joel met, for those who don't know. I was a participant in his research at UW La Crosse.
Yeah. I think I saw you dunking in the gym before that at some point, though. So I think I was like barely dunking, and you were like doing windmills or something like that.
I could see that.
So, it is interesting, actually, now that you say that, and I don't want to talk about this too, although it could feed into jumping, but it is interesting because your jumping style, Dan, does seem to be a little bit more, like you said, you have a lot of calf mobility. Like you use up a lot of the slack in your calves. And maybe that became, you can do that obviously off of 2 feet a lot more in the second to last leg and whatnot. But I'm curious how much you think, you just said it. I'm curious how much that did end up kind of defining versus if you just start doing like long jump and sprints and hurdles from a long time ago and how that would have changed your profile.
Hard to say how much. I don't know. I believe some, though, because I do think, people don't generally need to be concerned about negative impact of calf raises. But
I don't think so.
A couple sets of 100, 5 days per week, that,
How long did you do that? How long did you do that for again?
So that was like when I was 13, I did that for probably over a year straight, like into age 14.
Yeah.
And then, by the time I was 15, I know I had like changed routines. I was on more of like a 2 days per week, and I had like more exercises going on. But yeah, I don't remember exactly when I stopped doing that, but over a year for sure of like weekly, 5 days per week, sets of 100 calf raises. Yeah, sets of 25 on squat was what I was doing.
Nice. I did sets of 20 on bench when I was unwittingly, I was somehow intuitively in the ether doing 1 by 20 long time before, but I did it every day. I brought my bench up to it was a weight bench in the basement, brought it up to my room, and I did 1 set of 20 every night. And actually, I increased my bench for a long time that way, actually, until I finally, stalled out. It was never great, but it is funny how everything can work for a little while. I did, now that you say it, Dan, I did a lot of calf raises too, but I did, I remember doing like single leg with a bar on my back. I don't think I ever did 100. I would get bored. I don't know how you must have more dedication than me, because I would have gotten bored at that point. I did.
I don't know what was wrong with 13-year-old me. I don't.
I quit after week 3. It's too many jumps.
Yeah, okay. So my bench press was in my bedroom, which was in the basement, and the end of the bar literally like hung over me while I slept. And my bench press was also my squat rack. So what I'm saying is my beginnings are more humble than yours, Joel.
I will say I did have a bench press squat rack, but it was a kind of squat. Like it went high enough that you could still squat it. And so, but I didn't sleep under it. I did not sleep under it.
I had a drum set in that room too at one point. It was pretty crowded.
Yeah, you got the rhythm. You got the rhythm and the weights, man. That's something. I was going to say too, as you were talking about the hurdles, and Tim, you were talking about the jiu-jitsu and the martial arts. I just had a podcast with Ryan Banton not too long ago. He was talking about for his track athletes, like everyone hurdles, like their freshman year, everyone hurdles, no matter what year. I think. If you're like a discus thrower, I don't think you do, or. But if you're a sprinter, you hurdle. And I was thinking, if you think of like general physical preparation, sometimes I think, well, ultimately part of the beauty of being a human is there's so many different things to do. But if there was like a general, phys ed has kind of become sports performance in some respects, and if it's like, well, how can we prepare people for a variety of abilities? I think, well, if we were doing martial arts and hurdling, I think those are 2 pretty good general abilities that I think would go a long way for developmental, or even like early high school or whatever. Maybe if I, when I coach track on the high school level, be like, all right, we're all going to wrestle for 10 minutes. and then we're all going to hurdle up. The coach is crazy. I suppose I probably would. The wrestling, maybe not, but yeah, I'm just curious, or maybe either your thoughts or maybe Tim in particular with that, or I don't know. Like Dan, I know you do hurdling or have athletes hurdle as well, and Tim, I'm curious if some of the actual grappling stuff ends up, with football or whatever, or any of the actual grappling stuff ends up in your sessions. Just curious about those aspects of things.
So, it's tough because one, I think if I would make an addition to that list, I would say, grappling or wrestling, hurdling, racing, making every bit of it being competitive. And then also, some sort of tag, maybe like even with like some obstacles involved. I'll use my daughter as another example. She's going to be the star of the show. She goes to gymnastics and she does parkour, and which, I know that you've done episodes in the past, with either parkour athletes or coaches. And, I saw these kids at 4 and 5 years old, and and 6 and 7, and the bulk of their training is like broad jumps for distance, bounding for distance, jumping from one mark and trying to jump as far as they can and land on one foot, climbing up a wall. So naturally she's enrolled in parkour now. She does it every Tuesday night and she loves it. And they play this game. It's called flag tag. And you have to bear crawl or crab walk, some form of interacting with the ground, and you're playing tag. And if you stand up, you're out. And then obviously if someone pulls your flag, you're out. And I'm just watching her, first of all, jealous because it looks like so much fun. And she's clearly having a blast, but like she's training. She doesn't know it, but like she's getting stronger. She's learning how to dodge and manipulate and use her body to impact the other person and create space and separation. So, I think anything like that where there's a gamification piece where you're having to interact with another person or several people and account for all that stuff at the same time, that can be really invaluable. And the earlier, the better.
Yeah. Yeah, that sounds. I know Rafe Kelly, who I mentioned the Return of the Source. He was posting videos of his son, who I think at age 8 had he does a lot of things, but spends a ton of time at the ninja gym. He's always posting like the parkour gym, and his kid already has like a huge standing broad jump and like does a lot of things really well athletically. And I'm like, man, like this is such an important. I just had a post on social media just talking about depth jumps, and I was like, the longer I've been through this, the more I think like all the things that we talk about depth jumps as a holy grail, and it's a great tool, but there's so many things you can do before you get to that are, I think, really valuable. And I think Jake Tura had done kind of like a poll of all the different like pro dunkers or something, and it was interesting because it seemed like a lot of them weren't that heavy on plyometrics. It was more like lots of dunking, playing, and strength training were the base, and then I maybe some did more plyos, maybe some didn't, but I'd be curious to you guys' thoughts on that as well. And, Dan, I know you talked about fun jumps. This is actually like one of the first questions with jumping, that I had. But yeah, thoughts on like if you built a pyramid of, and maybe we'll start with talking more about jumping, but that leads to like a very high eventual peak of jumping ability. I'm sure there's a lot of ways to get there. But just thoughts on that, especially in terms of, parkour, low rim dunks, fun games that, volleyball, obviously, right? Like you talk about games, like as you were talking to even Tim, I was thinking, well, how could I, mess with the constraints around basketball to make a game that rewarded even more athleticism out of it? You know what I'm saying? Like, which I wouldn't have needed because I was good. I was bad at the skill stuff in basketball, but like it was all the decision making and managing, like anxiety about the game and things or whatever. Like that was my problem. It wasn't, but I as you're talking, it's like, oh, how could I make the game even more, athletically demanding? So anyways, curious on like a pyramid of jumping, thoughts on fun jumps, diverse jumps, and Dan, you obviously talked about, hurdling as well. I know, Dan, you talked about this as well in the first podcast we did, but yeah, just collaboratively talking about building towards like an ultimate, like higher pyramid of performance when it comes to jumping and skill development through the years.
Yeah. So I think, the thing that I've talked about a lot is just like that history of jumping. And you just have to jump in a way that's fun and do it consistently for years. But, what comes to mind, like with this conversation, is okay, that should come on top of a base of more variety. And that's where I think, yeah, running, agility, yeah, interacting with an object or other people on the ground, like that all should be in the early childhood, movement variety scope. Um, and then, yeah, I like also like throwing. I don't like, maybe not directly going to translate to higher jumping, but just the connectedness of the body, upper to lower, the velocity, of the arm movement, just things like that. Like I think throwing is a good thing to have a history of doing as well. And then yeah, so I think like the parkour taps into that. I think yeah, like the tag stuff, that's all good. I honestly, I do like the idea of like kids sprinting and racing in a straight line, for sure. Then yeah, honestly, the grappling or the wrestling, that there's an appeal there as well to me, as far as having that background of yeah, physicality and you know, not we're not just operating in a limited plane here. But it's just like we're trying to battle somebody in any possible way we can, and every direction that you can think of your body can move is going to use. Like I like that too. So yeah, I guess wrestling, racing, some type of agility, and throwing would be my base of the pyramid, and then from there, at some point, get obsessed with jumping and do that consistently for a long time. And then at some point, after you have years of those things, okay, now we add in strength and we make that a long-term pursuit as well. And because we have this background of all these other things, the strength is going to transfer well. And then we just, keep jumping and getting stronger over the course of the rest of your career. There's my pyramid. Oh, and I guess plyos come in somewhere too.
I just to piggyback off that, like I think that there's so much value in, because I still train a lot of high school athletes, and I train at every level currently, and like something that I've found is the best athletes, the most intuitive athletes, were already really explosive, fast, powerful, good movers, however you want to look at that, before they touched a weight or before they took weight training seriously. And I think that there's something to be said too, just from observation, where, the kids that mature a little faster physically, just not necessarily more explosive or faster, but are just able to throw their weight around, especially, with field sports or contact sports, who learn to rely on their strength and use that as their primary mode of being able to dominate or win. And then everyone else catches up. And now it's like, okay, now you have to start thinking about, what do I need to do to get more athletic? Because you don't just look at size and say that person's athletic. You look at someone who's big and can move and can jump and can run and can make decisions quickly. And so I in personal opinion, I find that the best athletes, the best movers, the most dynamic playmakers are generally people who have had a lot of exposure to like a bunch of different movements or bunch of different modalities that are fast, that can jump high, that can move well, and then they get strong. So if I had to, take my daughter again, if I'm making the master plan for her eventual D1 scholarship, I would hope that she learns how to develop these qualities of being explosive, jumping well, sprinting fast, moving efficiently, and then being able to infuse some raw horsepower in the form of strength training on top of that.
Yeah, that's actually something I wanted to ask you guys about, was that like progression, when to get into strength training and who strength training works better for. But actually, before I get to that one, I had that like little blurb about, well, constraints on basketball, right? Like, how do we ramp up the athleticism? And as you were talking, Tim and Dan, I was thinking about Jeremy Frisch talking about growing up playing tackle basketball on the little hoop, like in their house or something. And I was like,
awesome.
I think that covers maybe the most bases. Or if it was like, especially if it's like low rim and you can dunk it, if it's like there's tackling, there's grappling, and you can dunk. There was some, oh yeah, go ahead.
A basketball hoop in a 3-foot pool is the most fun. Listen, at least for this guy, like me and a few buddies that are overly competitive, give us a basketball and a hoop that sits about 3 feet above a 3-foot shallow end of a pool. And there will be wrestling, there will be trash talking, it'll be dunking on each other. Like that to me. And I did that growing up, just like every day, like we're going to my buddy's pool and we would wrestle and eventually get into actual fights and have to be separated. But all of that, all of those days stacked up together. I think there's a lot of value in that. And there's this play component. But yeah, I would say the water polo / tackle football / basketball is like the perfect mix of all of those things.
The ultimate, it's the quest for the ultimate game. I think I used to be on the quest for like the ultimate exercise. It's like, oh, what's the best? Like there was in the old DB Hammer or whatever book. It was like the depth jump with the bands pulling you down and the people step their feet off. And that's the ultimate exercise. To be honest, I found that actually does work pretty well. It's not one I tend to use a lot, but it's in my experience, it has, when you're ready for it, it's worked pretty decently. But that being said, I care a lot more about, well, what's the ultimate environment? The ultimate environment. What's the ultimate game? And there's no ultimate game, but I will say something like tackle, which I never had the honor of being able to play tackle basketball. I'm sure it would have invoked many fights between my brother and I. But I was also thinking about a good one. I was thinking about how you get hurdling in there, chasing. There was a good one, King of the Course. Rafe Kelly had talked about maybe on the last show. Yeah, him and Charles St. John was on. But basically, it's like you have logs in a U shape, and one team starts at one end. You could even just have plyo boxes lined up across the gym. Basically, you have one team on one end, one on the other. You have little rocks scattered throughout that you can step on. You just can't get knocked off the log or the rocks. And then it's basically a shoving wrestling match to get to the other side. And you can stand there and fight. You can stand in a corner and stand your ground. You can try to hold the person in front of you from getting knocked off. You can try to jump on the rocks and make your way. It always ends up though, 95% of your attempts will end up in you getting shoved off the log, and then you just run back. It's like King of the Hill kind of. It's just I always think about, how do we infuse these fun, roughhousing, childhood type games with, and then blending that and leading that into athleticism, because it's all there. The aggressiveness too, I think, really brings a lot of those inner athletic qualities out. It's like a watering, it's like a fertile soil for that to grow. And so the next question actually that I wanted to ask you guys was, and maybe, well, I do want to ask about the skill before the lifting, how you view that progression and when we get into weights and things. But actually what I'll do is I'll skip a question, and I wanted to talk about assessments and warm-ups really. Is how do you guys treat the warm-ups in the sense of games? We have a lot of tools at our disposal, and I'm sure it depends on the group, but we have games or explorations or more typical movement prep or more typical speed related warm-ups and those things. Tell me a little bit about how you guys view the warm-up process leading into whatever the main brunt of the session is, depending, I'm sure very group dependent as well. So if you want to give a few examples, that's cool too, but thoughts on how you guys go about that?
So I would say I do more of a traditional warm-up style most often. Part of that is because I do one-on-one training, so that the gamification is a little tougher, the competing is a little tougher. I do that because I want to get some of the training stimulus starts right away in the warm-up. Extensive plyos being a key one there. Skipping, things like that. I'm starting to get some things in that I want to from just a workout standpoint within the warm up. I do wrinkle in things when it's one-on-one, just things like catching a ball in different ways. Been messing around with ducking under a rope in different ways or like crawling under it different ways. Like I'll mix those types of things in. But it might be 2 minutes of that. And then, it's like, yeah, it's like we're still going to do some lunges, still going to do some hinges. I'm going to ask them about things during the warm up. That's another part is it's conversational, whereas games are not that way so much. So yeah, I'm still tend to be a little more on that traditional like dynamic warm up type of approach with just a little bit of the play mixed in there.
Yeah, I'm with Dan there. Dan and I've adopted Dan's traditional dynamic warm up over the years pretty much and added some things in that I like personally. But to piggyback off what he was saying, like having something consistent and I'll speak on it from a group setting and from one-on-one. So in the one-on-one setting, it is more difficult to gamify things. In the sense like it's hard to create that competition unless you're jumping in there with them, which sometimes I do. Sometimes I'm like, hey, I'm working out with you today, man. And kids love that. They love it. It's fun for me. So that's a way to sort of spice things up. And naturally I've developed a relationship where I'll trash talk them and they can give it, receive it. And, depending on the person, but most kids, they do well with that. But whether it's like, starting from like squatting, hinging, lunging, all the way up into like extensive hops, single leg hops, skipping for height, skipping for distance. All of these things are an incredible assessment tool, session to session. Are they improving? What levers can we pull to improve certain qualities? And even from the very first session, like using that dynamic warm up as an assessment in and of itself, like a movement screen, like, okay, like, can this person perform a squat? If they can they perform it well? All the way to like, do they know how to skip? Like, can they even skip? And Joel, you guys here might not be surprised, but like and forget the high school athletes, some adult athletes, they go to skip and they're like, wait a minute now. And I say start small, find rhythm, find timing, and then we can start to push out. And they'll have to do 2 or 3 reps where they're just focusing on getting connected back to the skill that is skipping. And then we can go for height and then we can go for distance. But on the other end, with like some of the larger groups, for example, the NFL offseason training program here the other day, it was a smaller group. We've been working together for a while. We went and played Danny ball outside. And for anyone who doesn't know what that is, it's basically volleyball, but with a medicine ball instead. And we did that for 45 minutes. And that was the majority of the session for that day. And it was awesome. Lots of trash talking, lots of guys laying out, but also, a great stimulus. And then, we went and had basically a beach day upper body workout after that. So, yeah.
Yeah. Yeah. I'm curious just because I think there's a lot of ways you can run a warm up. There's a lot of roads to Rome. I think part of it fits with a little bit, even with your own personality, to a degree. I think some coaches' personalities are just a little bit more structured and a little bit more ABC, and other people, especially people who I think are a little more ADD, I point at myself on that one. Like if I watch, and I know my bias, like if I watch like and I did this for years where I would watch a warm up go by piece by piece by piece. And if I was always thinking, well, if I'm bored, you guys got to be bored. And a lot of times that was 100% true. And then part of it, I guess, has been, how do you retain enough structure to, like you said, you have things that you can see and observe, especially with a large group. Because I do think that with a large group and you want to be able to see how they're moving and being able to check various elements that lead up into the main session, I do see the importance in that. It's just, for me, a lot of my in-persons are one-on-one, and I think I've done so many things. I borrowed this idea from like Tyler Yerby and Michael Zufel and Sean Mishka. Basically, just you take a stick, and I think I've come up with a million ways that you can jump over the stick, dodge the stick, duck the stick. You can do the matrix while the stick goes over your head. You can I'll do like, you'll do a cartwheel over it. Like, I think I've almost exhausted those types of things, but I think sometimes one-on-ones, you know the person pretty well. And so you already know their general movement, characteristics and things like that. So yeah, it's something that too I was looking at. There was an art show I was watching. It wasn't a show completely about art, but someone had mentioned like the different types of art, and one is a surrealism. And this brought me back to like the humanities class in college that I just totally blew off. But I'm like, oh, this is important because like it was interesting. Like the surrealist artist, or part of surrealism is you literally just whatever your pen hits, you draw. Like you don't think about it. You just kind of like whatever's, and in that form of art, whatever's on the inside can just come out with a minimal amount of interference. And I do think like I've spent a lot of time mentoring under Paul Cater, who his whole warm up is that it is all surrealism. It is literally whatever is on my instinct, my gut, we're gonna do. And those were honestly some of the most fun, immersive, and exciting warm-ups I've ever done. But it'd be funny because like I remember one day we had an awesome workout, him and I together, that he had kind of just gone off that surrealist method. And the next day I was like, hey, that was awesome, Paul, let's do it again. And he's like, I can't. Like I can't, like, because you can't repeat. It's like a piece of art. You can't make the same piece of art twice. And so I think that could be frustrating for some people. I think if you're in a professional setting too, and you're like, ripping it off the cuff every day, some people are going to be like, I don't know. Like, is this good? Is this bad? Rhett Larson does that though for national organizations like pretty well. I wouldn't say it, but he plans it. He's got it all written out exactly what he's going to do beforehand. So even though it's different and there's a lot of games and things, it's still like, here's the thermogenic, here is the physiological. We are checking this box. All right, now we'll get into the games and some of the like novelty, I think like novelty, attention driving and those types of things. So I just rambled for a long time. Sorry. Anything you guys, any further things off that? Because again, I am definitely more my attention and what I think is fun tends to keep me on more the game end of things. But I'm just curious if you guys have any other thoughts on that one.
Yeah, I mean, I definitely wouldn't criticize anything anyway. Like,
Yeah.
like if someone has some reasons they're doing a warm up style a certain way, I'm like, okay, that's cool. And I'm definitely not opposed to like a completely play based warm up. Like, totally fine with it. Yeah, it's not my personal like instinctive style to do that. I also do like in my head, some of the things I think about are, okay, what is this athlete already doing? And like everybody that I train does their sport a bunch. They already have a lot of play going on.
The play bucket.
And it may be like one type of play, which is unfortunate. But yeah, I still have that view of like, okay, what are they doing? How much time do we have? And what do they really need to do in this 60 minutes? And yeah, just like a completely exploratory play-based 30-minute session of what like it's just not really going to be the right thing for that context. But yeah, certainly like shoot, me and Tim go to Zilker Park and we like throw a frisbee and like throw a football high over our heads and just try to catch it and whatever. And I break Tim's ankles constantly. Like
stop, false. But we do, or spike ball. Or
yeah.
He and I, there's this game, we'll take a racquetball and one of us will throw it and you have to catch it off one hop. But the goal of the person throwing it is to put it out where it's almost just out of reach. So it can only bounce one time and you have to catch it, right? And so there's this, you don't know where the ball is going to be thrown. So there's this element where you've got to read, react. You got to get on your horse to get to the ball. And then you got to do whatever you got to do. And, me and Dan being the way that we are, which is competitive, to say the least, is, eventually we're laying out, trying to catch this racquetball and we're dodging other humans that are just trying to have a normal time at the park. But yeah, so the play element, while it's not like it's not the standard necessarily. Dan and I both do that enough in our own training where it's like there's tons of value. And certainly like all of my best dunks have come after like a quick pickup game of basketball or like, for example, I jumped my best broad jump ever was 32 feet and
triple broad jump.
Triple broad jump. Thank you.
Yeah,
yes. Thank you.
Were you on the moon? Yeah. Were you on the moon, Tim?
Thank you, Dan, for bringing me back down to earth. Triple broad jump, 32 feet, but it was after playing, 45 minutes of pickleball. Which actually, during this conversation, I've been thinking to myself, I'm like, God, I got a kid who would love to play pickleball. We're going to do that for his warm up next time he comes in. So yeah, I do think that there's a time and place. I think constraints and how much time you have, and the group setting definitely makes a difference on whether or not it makes sense. But that being said, like I do like to spice it up from time to time.
Yeah, I think, like you said, Dan, there's so many ways to do it. I guess if I think about it too, I look at it as there's always like a balance point. There's the Dantian or the middle, the Tao, like where it's almost like if you had 4 days a week, because I've been through this myself where I remember I had a stretch, it was about age 36, and I think I just had 2 kids and working for a long time, my nervous system was just not in a great place. My lifts were kind of down. And so to counter that, I like literally every day was a game for warm up, and which is cool. But I do think that it's not as special when to play a game sometimes when you don't do more traditional stuff. And so it's like, because if you are doing traditional over and over again, and then the one day you go play a game, kids are like, yeah, like they are so excited. And it's almost even more. I just did a really good podcast with Scott Robinson talking about attention. I mean, that is like, you're going from a somewhat mundane to attention. And I guess the thing is why I always want to drive attention, but there is also maybe, and I don't want to call it novelty to discipline necessarily, but there is something about like, I'm training hard. There is a level. And I look at even like, there's a lot of ways to do it too. Like swimming, you do have a traditional warm up, but you also have a social kick at the beginning. You're on a kickboard, kicking, talking to your buddies, whatever. You're not really, it's like Richard Eshavis was talking about, I don't think on my podcast, but like he'd start his Gen Pop clients, like grab a buddy and you're going to carry a sandbag together. Like one person carry it, you can like walk by your buddy and then drop it off or something. And then, but then you would, I think like in the swimming, after you do the social thing, you'd get into the more traditional. I think there is, like, especially coming from a track background, I do think that I love games. I mean, I remember, I think that's about where I was headed at Wilmington. It was my last year there where I had started with 1 game a week on Wednesday and every other day was traditional. And then 2 years into it of the 4, 3 years into it of the 4, we were warming up with the ultimate frisbee twice a week. And I think that was about the sweet spot. Like twice a week, like is fun. And I mean, it's all, I guess, fun if you do track. Like, I mean, not everyone loves doing the typical warm up stuff, but I guess, yeah, just thinking about that because there is that mindset of I am going to train with this specific directive today. And I do think that if it's always a game, you could potentially, run the risk of not ever kind of finding that discipline on some level. And maybe there's something that to be considered as well.
Yep.
That'll lead me into, I think we were with the assessment. I asked you part of the question or part of the theme there, but with assessments, like we've all, heard about the FMS or like, and the research with that and like trying to find what matters when we run athletes through, not just like the warm up, but the actual assessment. The warm up can be the assessment, of course, but I'm curious what you guys' process is on assessing athletes. So do you run them through the same test, everyone who comes in? What do you look at that you are going to go back to? Curious how you guys go through that assessment type process in your training.
Yeah, so I have a combine basically that I do, which is 10, 20, 40-yard sprints, fly time, and then vertical jump, broad jump. I'll do different types of vertical jump depending on the athlete. Like, I'm always going to do standstill, but then some people I'm going to do like approach off 2 and approach off both single leg jumps. Then RSI. Sometimes I'll do single RSI, depends on the athlete. And then also the 1080 sprint. We have that for feedback as well. And then, at some point I'll probably get a look at how strong they are, but that's not usually like an urgent matter in my opinion, with at least not with the population that I work with. So yeah, it's basically a combine and it'll get shifted a little bit. Like, I may not do max velocity right away with a volleyball player, like it's not as much of a concern, but I do still want to try to train that piece. But yeah, it's like, a whole series of metrics and then I'm trying to improve them over time. So I if somebody is healthy and reasonably energetic, I'm usually going to test something in a session. And then, yeah, just try to get that, metric driven process going over time. The hopping and bounding realm is another one where I'll do like eight bounds for distance from a standstill or something like that. That's usually like a pretty accessible test for people. Sometimes I'll start them with 4 bounds per distance because it's just, it's not as fast. But yeah, so I do straight up combine style and then try to keep them getting better at those metrics over time.
Yeah, mine's not nearly as extensive as Dan's. Dan is like that's extensive, and it's like that's awesome. I think this is also a lens into just our personality types. Mine is going to be much more focused around exactly like what the athlete's telling me. And most of the time, like let's say I'll use the volleyball girls for example. Like their metrics for whether training is successful or not is their vertical jump improving and is their 2-step approach jump improving. And it's really easy to use those as an assessment and ultimately like a barometer for whether or not that success is happening. And it varies from group to group, athlete to athlete. It's incredibly circumstantial around like what it is that the assessment is going to be in terms of like, for example, Dan mentioned, and I do this with my volleyball girls too, where I'm probably not going to make max velocity something where I'm timing or something where it's like the standard for whether or not their overall athleticism is improving, but they do it and they do it on a regular basis because I know there's a lot of value in it. But that's not what's moving the needle for them, and it's not what's exciting for them either. So, depending on the athlete, depending on what's important to them, and Dan mentioned strength. Some athletes come to me and it is important. Like that's important to them that their bench or their squat or their deadlift gets better. And so what I'll do is from the beginning, I'll say, okay, great. Let's find out where you're at. And then we can use that over time to say like, hey, here's where this is improving. And use those things, the things that matter to them a lot. And then I have my things selfishly where it's like, I want to know how far they can broad jump or triple broad jump, or are their hops improving? So yeah, it varies athlete to athlete. I do like to lean heavily on what they're telling me matters most. And then I can start to tease out or like, hey, let's pick 3 or 4 things where these are going to be our markers for improvement, and ride with those. So it's a little collaborative in that sense.
Cool. So you guys, both of you, what's interesting is when I originally asked that question, I mentioned like the FMS, and I think about the full spectrum. Like I think usually when people think assessment, it's like because you have like I guess micro to macro level things. Like something that's more like an FMS or anything related to that is going to be a little bit more micro. It's like whereas if you're measuring someone's sprint time, there's multiple but subtle, but multiple strategies from a joint perspective that someone could get that eventual sprint time, and you could observe that. But then you take that all the way down to something like even like I never actually did the FMS. I just watched it happen. It's like step over and the push up thing. But I think about like a test that I would do for an athlete who like if they have an injury history, if they've had issues in the past, and I want to get under the hood a little more, like a straight leg raise test or something under scrutiny, and they're not cheating or something like that. To me, that's like a micro, like a real micro. Mm-hmm. But I think that what generally the research has shown, at least, and again, the all the stuff people post about the FMS, but I think with the micro, you just have to be very, like I've seen people do that and they never come back to it, or they come back to it, but like someone just got better at the test itself. But it's like, well, if it's sprinting is the test, you've been doing sprinting your whole life in some way, shape, or form. So it's not like you game the test on that one, and if you did get better, a lot of things got better. And I do think about like everything is an assessment, right? And a lot of times even as well, like you can watch someone sprint and you can actually see hip extension showing up. I think, but part of it too is, doing the hip extension test and the micro also helps you when you then look at that athlete sprinting, like, oh, I see that's jacked up there, or whatever. But you can have athletes do lunges and watch lunges closely and see something similar as well. So I think there's a lot of ways to end up getting that. But I just think, ultimately like trying to measure what really matters and what we see every day. And I think what we see every day is the easiest. Training is almost the first thing we should have in our assessment. And then branching out from that maybe are the little micros more that, I guess that's the way I say it. I kind of just put that together a little bit as you guys are talking, but that's kind of how I do it as well. It is start with a lot of the macro, but if I feel like I need to get into under the hood stuff at all, I'll venture there, but that's not what every athlete gets, because I feel like that can set the precedent up of, oh, well, what's wrong with you? You failed this, and this. And, now you're, well, that's got to get better. You're a liability or whatever. And it's like, well, now you've just now you're underwater mentally a little bit before we even got started in some sense. I think a lot of athletes just forget it. Like I did plenty of testing back in the day with a set protocol I was supposed to do. And working for a university, that athletes would be like, "Yep, fail," and they would joke about it, ha ha ha, and then, but we wouldn't even go back to it really because I don't know, like it's kind of funny. So, yeah, curious on your thoughts on that, like nocebo, like anything you'll do that's more micro, at any point, or thoughts on some of the more movement-ish type assessments.
So I think I'd mentioned earlier around, from a more micro perspective, now to kind of put it under that lens, it's like the dynamic warm up and being able, like, that's the first thing I have everyone do because it has all these rudiment elements of movement, or at least what I perceive to be where, there's a squat, there's a hinge, a front lunge, a lateral lunge, and then into extensive, and then, well, I'll pause there. So like, instead of like if someone squats and it's a mess or they can't touch their toes or they don't know how to hinge, like it's not a pass fail thing. Like and this is an ode to assessment systems where like I've gone down those rabbit holes of overhead squat testing and PRI and all the different lenses that you can look at these things through, and not all of them. I haven't obviously gone through all of them, but I've gone through and I've spent enough time.
Yeah, it would take lifetimes to go through all of them.
Yeah, gosh. But and I've been able to take bits and pieces from all of those things, but ultimately it doesn't become like a pass fail. It becomes, what do I have in my toolbox that I can give them, whether it's constraints or removing things, whatever, to allow them to accomplish that task. And generally speaking, like 9 times out of 10, especially when it comes to the more rudiment movement stuff, experience has probably given me the tools necessary to help them complete that task. And it doesn't have to be something where we're spending time going through a lot of breathing drills or having to fix anything about what their movement is. And then also too, like when you get into the contacts, more extensive plyos and more intense things, it can tell you a lot around, particularly, with athletes, what they're driving from. Is this person particularly elastic? Are they more like me, which is kind of slow and more muscular driven in their movement? And those things can, but between that and just getting an idea of how well they're or how poorly they're able to squat, lunge, hinge. I got a lot of information right there. And then, going back to why that dynamic warm up is really useful over time is like, there's a double-edged sword because it's like, one, they're getting better at the test, but like, isn't that a good thing? Particularly with, a squat, a lunge, a hinge, hopping on one foot, skipping, bounding, like these are tests that I want them to get good. Like I want them to get good at these tests. Isn't like that kind of like the whole purpose of what we're trying to accomplish? So yeah, in that sense, like it's never, and my situation here at Kollective, like I have a medical staff now too. So if someone isn't able to do something, and I know that I don't have anything that I can give them to get them out of that, then I can give them the medical, and we speak a lot of the same language, have a lot of the same background. So, I've kind of got it easy in that regard. But yeah, anyway.
Yeah.
Yeah. I would just kind of second that, like, as far as the micro assessment, that's where the watching the warm up is really, as far as I take that generally. Yeah, I mean, you can see things when somebody does those basic movements, like, oh, okay, they don't want to bend their knee today. There's something going on,
Right.
It's just qualitative assessment. It's not a formal test. There's no scores. I do have cases of somebody like teenage males who are extremely tight in like the hamstrings in particular, and then they try to hinge and they can't, or they can barely move, and it's like, and I'm like, hey, okay, we need that range of motion to change over time. Like that's going to be good for you. but it's still not a score. I'm not actually measuring anything. It's just, you just, it's qualitative. You can identify things that you want to, see them get better at from that. But that's as far as the micro goes for me.
Yeah, I think the bottom line is, especially in the sports performance realm, and it is nice, like you said, when you have like that sports medicine staff there, for it's like you could start with all the macro stuff, the performance oriented stuff, the stuff that doesn't need a number, and if a kid does need something, then they can go. That's more of a specialty thing. It's not everybody. It's not everyone gets singled out. Everyone has this wrong with you on that, So I definitely see the value in that. I did really want to, I know we're running out of time. I wanted to quickly cover just one or really two more things. And the one is something I'd wanted to get to when you guys were mentioning it. And it's actually something, Dan, I think maybe I was thinking about asking you the last time you were on, but you guys already alluded to this. But it's the idea that, maybe I'll just say this, when and how do you see the inclusion of weightlifting in long-term development, in the sense that you were saying, like, it's the kids who are the most athletic that then get strong and do the most with it, versus, a kid who has had a horrible pyramid base comes to this gym or whatever, get me strong, and it's just like, it's just not going to be the same. Maybe their standing vertical goes up a little bit, but it's just not like the same result. Anyways, I'm kind of taken away from the question because I'm adding on too much to the question here. I'm putting too much into the question. You guys, go ahead. Tell me what you think about that. We only got like 10 minutes left, so I was trying to make it a quicker thing. But let me know what you guys think there.
So, it's kind of like what we alluded to before, where you want to have all the athletic and the specific, like, explosive and elastic components in place first. And then you get easy transfer. And where I've learned this from is actually from adults. Guys who have come to me looking to, in their 30s, they're looking to like finally dunk. And it's like, oh yeah, I've sort of casually played tennis when I was younger. And, I like to work out a little bit here and there. And now I want to go on this jump journey. And then it's like, okay, once upon a time when I was 22, it's like, oh yeah, get your squat up. That'll work. And then, you eventually learn, like, no, it might not. They very well may add 80 pounds to their squat and jump like an inch higher. Like, there's just not that any guarantee of transfer when you don't have that base, that background of athleticism, or like athletic, variety and development. So there was a post I made sometime in the past couple of years about something along the lines of, you can't replace a childhood of athletic activity with a 6-week jump program, or something like that. And I really, really believe that, like, you need that athletic diverse background, and then years of jumping, like if you're going to get really good at jumping, or years of sprinting if you're going to get really good at sprinting. So as far as the kids, I would gravitate toward waiting till they hit puberty to do, like, actual, like, weightlifting, like, maximum strength training. I know I don't think there's like evidence that it's going to be problematic if they do it at a young age, but certainly it should not be something that makes up like a majority of their exercise, or even, even a quarter of their exercise. It should be, a tiny, tiny fraction, if at all. So you really want to focus on those explosive components first.
Yeah, so I think it's the when and how, that really is like the crux of the question here. And I, to kind of piggyback off what Dan was saying, I held me and another trainer here. His name's Trey Hardy. He's a silver medalist in the decathlon and a freak of nature. He's just an absolute alien. We had this corporate thing where they wanted to come work out with him, right? It's like 14 people. They all work desk jobs. Well, within the context of these 14 people, one is a former Olympic diver, one played football for the University of Texas, and then some other, random athletic backgrounds. And if you had just lined these people up, we did a vert test, and if you'd line them up, two stood out, the former athletes, but then everyone else kind of looked the same. There was no, and every single person, there was, like Gary from accounting had like a 26-inch vertical. And I was like, hold on, timeout. What is going on here? And he had played sports his whole life. He didn't really weight train anymore, but growing up, and then he had been a runner, for the past, 10 years of his professional life or whatever. Right. So he's still getting in all these contacts. And I'm thinking to myself, like, golly, if I could just get Gary under a bar or a hack squat for like 6 weeks, like what could Gary do, And I don't know that there's like all that to say, I don't know that there's like a perfect time or like when it should be infused. Like, how can you quantify like when someone's ready? And, I think theoretically, as I'm teasing this out loud with you guys, like, maybe when the sprinting, the jumping, all of those things, like the potency, the return on the investment from just those things begins to stall. Like that, in terms of like a logical progression, makes the most sense for me, where it's like, okay, like, we're not getting the feedback. We're not getting the same sort of stimulus that we used to. Now let's introduce this new external tool, implement, and see how your body reacts and responds. So, and I would almost assume, with people being so different, that might happen for someone at 15 and it might be 19 or 20 for someone else. Though I got to say, it's like, good luck keeping a male athlete 18, 19, 20 away from the weight room that long, when there's so much correlation to ultimately realizing your eventual athletic potential with the weight room, So yeah, I would say there's no true answer. The logical side of my brain says like when everything else stops driving performance.
Yeah, I like that. It fits a lot with what folks like, I guess it's more like the ultimate athletic concepts type people, Joseph Johnson, Jeff Moyer, and Jeff's talked a lot. And then like the Russian literature, like sensitivity, like as soon as you incorporate something, you're now less sensitive to it and let things run their course. And otherwise, it's like we have so much stuff available to us, especially today, like all the means, like you could just do them all at once. I'm not going to get all the results quick. And yeah, maybe you could kind of for a little while, but it's like there's something about letting something run its course until you're kind of eking things out. And then you can put in the next stimulus. And like you said, it's going to be different for everybody. And I do think like, yeah, running like some basic, like, just the skill of general strength training, like dumbbell, like goblet squat. Yeah, that stuff's cool, whatever. But and I think about my own career a lot in the sense of I didn't have a strength coach growing up. I figured out weights myself. And I remember in my early years, like trying to do squats. I'm like 14. I'm trying to like get this concrete bar, like weights bar in my back. And I'm like, I don't know how the hell to do this. So I'm just going to not. And I just did some wall sits and whatever. But to be completely honest, I'm almost really glad that I didn't have a coach having me do like deadlifts and deep squats and things. Not that those aren't good. Those helped me a lot later. But I think because I didn't have someone teaching me those things early on, and actually, I did sumo deadlift when I was like in 10th grade, some cleans and stuff. And then I finally got into the more high intensity, like the deep squatting and stuff over the next 2 years. But I honestly think I'm a lot better off for what I eventually did was just track and field jumps, which was pure balance. I think if I would have had a strength coach hitting me with the deep squats and deadlifts, all that stuff when I was like 15 or 14 or end of middle school, I actually don't know if I would have done what I did because I think my athletic profile would have changed a little bit. And I also had the opportunity to get as much out as I could out of just like trying to dunk obsessively, doing all the random jump programs. And like, honestly, I think that was kind of good. And then I got into the actual meat and potatoes of the lifting later in high school. And when I did get that, then I even had another gear I didn't even know I had. And so it did stack really well for me. And then those main core lifts did help me through college as well. But I'm actually appreciative in my own journey that I didn't have someone actually, and I'm not saying every kid should be like that, but I think for what I ended up doing, that was super elastic and actually not like very standing vertical jump centric. That was an important progression. So I'm glad you mentioned that, Tim. If you guys have anything to add to that, definitely do. And then I'll just ask you guys before we get out of here, because I know our time's up. You guys have a jump program that you've worked on collectively. So any thoughts? And then share a little bit about your jump program. And then I was going to ask you about your epic, I'm sure, low rim dunking escapades, but or 10 foot or whatever you guys, do, but when you get together and train. But yeah, any additional thoughts? You guys jump program, and then we'll close out the podcast here.
Just one more thing regarding the when to start strength training. I will say, I work with like middle school and high school athletes mostly, and I haven't had the idea of like, oh, I wish that they wouldn't lift weights yet.
Mm-hmm.
But I have definitely had the idea of like, I wish they would lift weights much less than they do, or much more easily than they do. I think it's here in Texas, like they start lifting in 7th grade, whether they want to or not at school. And then it goes on. And if they're in, especially if they're in football, like it's a big part of their yearly training plan. And there have been plenty of young football players where I've been like, this dude's not going to get any faster after about freshman or sophomore year because he's going on this path of strength versus like over speed. And he's not like naturally explosive and talented with speed. So he needs to be focused more in that area. And if he's just like, half of what he's doing is getting stronger, it's not going to produce the athleticism that he wants. So I've definitely had that thought of like, I wish it was playing a smaller role early on.
Yeah, I've
got nothing else to add to that. I agree.
So Tim, you want to talk about jumping jack?
Yeah, I would love that. Yeah, so Dan and I collaborated. We created something called Jumping Jacked. A lot of jump programs are just that. It's just jumping. And like the name implies, you can jump high and get jacked. So Dan and I are both 220 plus, and we can both jump, and we both love the dunk. And it was something where, and even more than that, it's not just about being jacked and jumping. It's a full athletic development program. Jump high, lift heavy, sweet pumps, run fast, all the good stuff, man.
Awesome. Well, hey, thank you guys so much. I know we left we didn't even get into speed, but that's okay. A lot of really good stuff covered in about an hour 15 here. So I really appreciate talking to you guys. Thank you so much for coming on the show.
Yeah, it's been fun.
Awesome. Thanks, Joel.
Thanks for tuning in to another episode. We'll see you next week.